What does it take to come out ahead in this struggle for global primacy? How do you become one of the victors and avoid becoming one of the vanquished? Now, you might think, because this is a story about technology and warfare, that the answer that I would give you is you have to have much better technology than your adversaries. That sort of sounds logical, and yet, oddly enough, that has seldom been the key to long-term success, because what you see if you look at the history is, more often than not, successful technology tends to spread around very, very quickly. It tends to get copied very, very quickly. The classic example, of course, being one of the most successful R&D projects of all time, the Manhattan Project, which did a tremendous job of delivering the atomic bomb by 1945, and yet, boom, within 4 years, the Soviets had exactly the same thing. And we're seeing that process happening today. I mean, when you think back over the last several decades, one of the key American advantages over just about any adversary has been our system of satellite reconnaissance satellites. The imagery that we get from those satellites, going back to the Eisenhower administration, has been a multi-billion-dollar investment for the United States to give us an edge on the battlefield. Well, guess what? That edge is dissipating because anybody in the world today has access to satellite reconnaissance imagery. All you have to do is go to Google Earth. It's out there for anybody to use. And, you know, our enemies realize that. In fact, there was a story not too long ago that I saw saying that insurgents in southern Iraq were actually using Google Earth to do reconnaissance work on British military installations, which is pretty much what you'd expect to happen because successful technology tends to spread very quickly. And this is no longer an American monopoly. And that's been very much the pattern of history. So if you're not going to get a long-term lasting advantage based on superior technology, what does it take? Well, the answer I came up with after 4 years of study is not terribly surprising, and it's not terribly sexy, but it does have the advantage, I think, of being true, which is that it's organization, it's management, it's essentially who has a more effective governmental structure for harnessing commonly available technology. And let me give you an example of that from one of the most famous revolutions in military affairs of all time, the Blitzkrieg. Now, how was it that the Germans were so successful in the early years of World War II in overrunning such a vast portion of Europe? It wasn't because they invented the tanker airplane. It wasn't because they had more tanks and airplanes than the Allies. It wasn't even because they had better tanks and airplanes. A little-known fact, the French actually had better tanks than the Germans. And yet, why was it that France fell as quickly as it did? Well, there were a lot of reasons for it, but part of the explanation has to do with the fact that if there was any technological edge that the Germans had, it was from the fact that most of their tanks and airplanes had two-way radios, and that wasn't the case for the Allies. Now, again, the radio was not a German invention, right? It was invented by Marconi, an Anglo-Italian. Everybody in the world had radios in 1940, but only the Germans realized how incredibly important radios could be for enabling this fast-moving war of maneuver. So you could communicate with your units in the field, tell them what to do, change tactics on a day-to-day basis, and punch very rapidly through the enemy lines. Whereas the Allies didn't realize this was going to be so important because they were still locked in the static trench warfare mindset of World War I. They were preparing to fight another defensive battle where it didn't matter if you could communicate with your forces in the field because you weren't going anywhere. So the essence of the German victory wasn't better technology. It was the fact that they were able to outthink their adversaries and therefore to outfight them. And if you were looking for the German secret weapon, if there was one, I would argue it wasn't the Panzer or the Stuka or the radio. In many ways, it was the German General Staff, which was a supremely successful instrument of military organization going back to the early 19th century. The German General Staff pioneered many of the instruments of military planning, which are still in use by every military in the world, such as war games, for example. They were this group of intellectuals in uniform who planned for war and peacetime and did it much more successfully than anybody else and therefore made their enemies pay a heavy cost when fighting broke out. Now, there were limits to what even a very successful general staff could do, as seen from the fact that Germany wound up losing some pretty big wars, World War I and World War II in particular. But keep in mind that it only lost after the end of many years of fighting, which took a very heavy toll, and the Allies had to pay a huge, huge cost in blood and treasure to defeat the Germans after the initial gains that had been made in both wars. And that, I think, is an indication of the superior planning process that went into utilizing new inventions and integrating them into the German war machine.